Scholarship is a gesture of gratitude and a gesture of optimism, a gesture of gratitude to Victoria for providing me with a home after I finished my earlier career, and a gesture of optimism because I do believe that this country is capable of making its way in a large world, a world that confronts many uncertainties at this time, but is capable of doing it in ways which display its own judgments, its own abilities to think and act, and the qualities of its society. Every generation, I think, lives at a time which it thinks is terribly special, it's different from everything that's gone before. But I do think there are signals out there that we are here at the point of a serious point of history in the making. And New Zealand has got to learn how to conduct itself, to position itself in that world. And the universities, particularly this one, have a real job in informing and training people to do that. As Libby said, I was very lucky in my career. I both practiced international relations with the MFAT, and I taught international relations at the graduate level at Vic. I was very lucky. At the same time, on top of that, I managed to set up the Centre for Strategic Studies in 1993, and it was an exercise which, thanks to the wisdom, or it sowed a seed, if you like, and thanks to the wisdom of Victoria University, it led then to the creation of a professorship of strategic studies, unique in its kind, which now so well filled by Rob Asen, to whom, incidentally, I was responsible, for whom I was responsible in getting his first piece of gainful employment after he left university. Anyway, I don't really want to say anything more.
Tēnā koutou katoa, haere mai, nau mai. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to you all from near and far. As the founder and executive director of Diplosphere, it brings me great pleasure to welcome you for our special event, Forging an Independent Foreign Policy for Aotearoa New Zealand, Terence O'Brien's imprint. I hope you enjoy the networking drinks, which were generously provided by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I'm sure our guest of honor from above is also enjoying a glass of Chardonnay in hand. We have just listened to Mr. O'Brien speak about the establishment of the Terence O'Brien Scholarship at Victoria University in 2016. He mentioned two key points: that his scholarship is a gesture of gratitude and a gesture of optimism. In a similar vein, tonight's event is also a gesture of gratitude and of optimism. Of gratitude to Terence O'Brien for his significant contribution to New Zealand's independent foreign policy, and to his life partner for 60 years, Mrs. Elizabeth O'Brien, who's with us this evening. And optimism, as his thinking and work are timeless and will continue to shape our understanding of diplomacy and foreign policy for years to come. Mr. O'Brien has been a guiding light in the careers of many in this room and elsewhere, including my own at Diplosphere, which I founded 9 years ago, and at the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, as I was the first woman and youngest executive director for 3 years there. Mr. O'Brien spoke at 11 of the 75 international relations events that I led at these two organizations. The first was held in March 2014 on perspectives on the crisis in Ukraine, should New Zealand be worried? And this is the topic which is still relevant now. And the last one, and his last speaking engagement, was in June 2021 on New Zealand, Australia, and China. a false choice, ? Tonight marks his 12th appearance, at least in spirit. His fierce advocacy for independent thinking and diplomacy has been a constant in my life as well. This evening, we are very fortunate to have an outstanding panel, with each speaker having a special connection with Terence O'Brien. I have the pleasure to introduce the Right Honourable Jim Bolger, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Michael Falls, former New Zealand Ambassador to Indonesia, China, the United Nations in New York and the Pacific, and Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies, John O'Brien, CEO of Carbon Market Solutions and former advisor at the UNDP, and also one of Terence's sons, Malcolm McKinnon, New Zealand historian and associate professor at Victoria University. And last but not least, Chris Seed, Chief Executive and Secretary of Foreign Affairs and Trade at Infant. And we will hear Diplosphere co-founder Dan O'Brien for the concluding remarks. Each speaker has 8 minutes for contribution. Small bell donated by the guest of honor himself will ring when we will reach 7 minutes, indicating 1 more minute to go, and no exception for the family. Before we start, a few household rules. Please put your mobile phone in silent mode, but do feel free to tweet at #Diplosphere. In case of an earthquake, please draw cover and hold. In case of fire, please evacuate the building. In most cases, do not take the lifts. Now, without any further ado, Mr. Bolger, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, all. Especially want to acknowledge Elizabeth and the family. Difficult times for everybody, especially. Delighted you're here. And we've been given 8 minutes. That means there's 7 minutes, 35 seconds to go. You can relax. I'll try not to do more than 15 or 20. Terence Christopher O'Brien, global thinker. I think if anybody reflects on Terence's career and life and his writings, what comes through to me more than anything else is a capacity to see past the narrow close-in issues and see further and with the global vision for what we, the world, might do. The title of this little panel discussion, I think, was Forging an Independent Foreign Policy. That we can agree with, but that must be, of course, an insular isolationist policy. That's what we must avoid. We have our own views. We disagree with some who think they're close colleagues, and they are. But we have our own policy. I first met Terence in a sustainable way back when I was Minister of Labour. When we used to gather, the ILO, International Labour Organization, used to gather in Geneva. And I went there and spoke to them on more than one occasion. And of course, Terence, as our ambassador there, was scribe, mentor, and kept me usually out of trouble. The fault is his, of course, we wasn't there, but it was interesting. And then we moved through a couple of 3 years. 1983, I was elected the president of the ILO. Robert David Muldoon allowed me to be away for about 5 weeks out of the country. I have no idea, but he did. Maybe he was pleased that I was out of the country for that length of time. I have no idea. But the ILO, of course, started after World War I. League of Nations was designed to try and improve the social, infrastructure support for all citizens of the world, not just the few that had the money, as far as that goes. And that was the whole concept of social justice that the ILO was based on. So I was there in 1983 as the president of the ILO. That's a huge organization, size of the United Nations, maybe slightly bigger most of the time. It has delegates from the employers, the unions, and the government. I was the government, obviously, as Minister of Labour, I was the government representative there. And the President had the job of chairing a conference of 1,000 plus delegates for over a month. Challenging exercise. But the thing was, we didn't spend much time dealing with the labour laws of the countries concerned, whatever. It was, of course, during the Cold War era, so we spent most of our time debating international politics. And that was the issues that divided the 1,000-odd delegates there. And Terence was my right-hand supporter, guide, advisor, mentor, and of course took all the responsibility when we made a mistake. Did somebody do that? So that's where I first met Elizabeth and the family and Terence. And Foreign Affairs I rented whatever, a lovely home overlooking Lake Geneva, and we had many a reception up there. I would hate to tell you as New Zealand taxpayers how much it would cost me for me to be president of the island. Quite a little bit. I'll use that term, quite a little bit. It was, but it was an interesting insight to work with Terence at that time. Because, as I said, the issues were mainly global, not labour laws, etc., which was strange because it was set up to look after sort of social issues within the workplace. But it was certainly a very instructive period in my early political career, as far as that goes. And then the career went on, and I became Prime Minister. Some people wonder why or how, but that's right. And I was in New York speaking at the UN General Assembly. And it was after we had had the absolute parting of the ways with the United States by New Zealand's nuclear-free policies, and we weren't speaking to each other. There hadn't been a meeting between the New Zealand Prime Minister and the President of the United States for years, because, as I said, we weren't speaking to each other. Somehow they were supposed to solve issues, but never mind. And so in 1990, rather, I became a Prime Minister, and in 91 went across to address the UN General Assembly as is common. I have to say Terence's background work was sufficient because he was ambassador then in New York. Delighted to work with him again. It was sufficient that I coincidentally spoke immediately prior to George Walker Herbert Bush, the first George Bush. Now, that meant there was a few in the auditorium, or more correctly, as I put it, to President Bush, when we were having lunch after the event. He was fortunate I spoke first because then he had an audience to speak to. They obviously came to listen to me and stayed on for him. Quite simple. We did more than that. Of course, we, again, through the good offices of Terence and his team, we organised a meeting. A secret meeting, because we weren't having meetings between the leaders of New Zealand and the United States. After the reception that the US had put on, etc., we gathered in a big hotel room. Wife Joan and Barbara Bush over in that corner. They probably had very serious discussions over in that corner, and then George Bush and myself with Terence as my support person, and George Bush had General, his name's just gone out of my mind for a moment, but come back. And we sat down to have the first serious discussion between New Zealand and the United States for about 10 years on how we move forward from this impasse. And that's the advantage of people like Terence, who could see a different tomorrow and help to bring it about. Arrange a meeting, talk to somebody within the White House staff, no doubt, and agreed that they would meet afterwards with myself and Terence in attendance. And if you look at my first book, you'll see a photo of that particular event. So we started to build back with old allies, which are the United States. No, we didn't concede anything on being a nuclear-free policy. We stayed firm on that, and I hope New Zealand will always stay firm on that. And no, just to come right up to date, I don't think we need nuclear power submarines either. And if you can find any Australian official who can explain why they need nuclear power submarines, come and tell me. I'd like to know that. But I have the faintest idea what they're going to do with it. Perfectly honest, but there you go. It's only 400 billion plus there. We say it fast on that much money. One comprehension, but there you go. So Terence and I worked in those two gaps, the ILO at one end and the United Nations at the other, and it was a joy to work with him. As I say, he was a global thinker. He saw the world in its entirety, good, bad, and indifferent. And that's where it is. I mean, the essence of Terence comes through in the book, Presence of Mind, New Zealand and the World, that the Institute published. I'd love to think that every new member of Parliament coming in at the end of the year got a hold of that book and read it. They all will be much, much wiser as to where New Zealand fits in and thinks about world issues. And I think there are some wonderful insights in Terence's speeches and articles in that book. And those of you who haven't seen it, haven't read it, well, then get a copy from someone. Do so, because no, I mean very seriously. We are at a challenging time internationally, world politics. We know that President Putin and President Xi Jinping are meeting. We don't know what the outcome of that meeting is going to be, of course. We know we have a terrible war in Ukraine. We see every night. A war in Europe, a land war in Europe. We thought we'd given those up in 1945. And here we are, using more modern weapons, gathering more modern weapons to blow each other apart. Is there any other description other than madness? What are we trying to do? What are the leaders trying to do? I just wonder when we're going to calmly sit down and say, look, we only have one planet. We better concentrate on protecting that because, as the UN said yesterday, we're not doing enough, quick enough, fast enough. Instead, we're spending hundreds of billions on weapons to blow up countries that we say we love. Look at those terrifying pictures you see on television every night. And the whole central cities are blown apart. That's because we love that country. He says what Mr. Putin says. It's part of us. We need people like Terence O'Brien, who think like him, who can see a different tomorrow. Because we can't continue down the path we're on. We just can't. Where does it lead us to? Total destruction? Nuclear war? It's threatened now every second day. It's almost common now by inference to threaten nuclear war. How mad are we getting? So I just say, in recognizing the extraordinary person and diplomat that Terence was, as I said at the beginning, a global thinker. We need more global thinking. We need New Zealand to be in the front of global thinking. We can't force anybody to do anything. We're too small. We don't have the power. We don't have the money. We don't have any of that. All we can do is lead by intellectual argument and persuasion. And that we have no limit on doing it. We have the ability to do it. And to challenge New Zealanders to step up and not be silent. To speak up. To seek to persuade others they should follow likewise. No, we don't need nuclear powered subs. What could we use them? If anybody knows what's at the hand, I'll wait for 10 minutes. So thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm delighted to pay tribute to my friend Terence. I'm terribly sorry he's not with us, but his contribution to New Zealand and New Zealand's foreign policy will last a long, long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bolger, for your words of wisdom. Our next speaker is Michael Coles. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you, and kia ora koutou. I'd like at the very beginning to endorse and repeat in many ways the remarks of the former Prime Minister when he spoke about the pleasure of having Terence's family, Libby and most of the family here. I think that we say a lot about families of Foreign Service people, but we don't often do much about them. And I think having them present at a function like this is really crucially important. And I think that was a wonderful thing to do. I will not try to list the reasons why I am here today. That would be difficult. I think that we all believe that Terence deserves honouring for his contribution to the lives of all of us. And I'd like to borrow the words of the late Merv Norrish in the foreword which he wrote to Terence's publication, Presence of Mind in New Zealand and the World. Merv referred to, quote, the enormous debt that thinking New Zealanders owe to Terence O'Brien. That was written some years ago. It applies even more so now. And what I would like to do in talking to you, rather than giving you my own wisdom, which is not great, on foreign relations and Terence's role in it, what I would like to give you is just one example of Terence's exceptional foresight and wisdom. It appears in a contribution which he made to a conference held by the NZIIA in 2015 to mark the 70th anniversary of the United Nations. The conference papers were edited by Brian Lynch, who is here this evening, and published in 2016. Terence had contributed a paper entitled The Challenges of Maintaining Small Nation Influence. A challenge, incidentally, which I believe all Aotearoa New Zealand diplomats have wrestled with from time to time, some of us most of the time. This is an extract from Terence's remarks. The task for smaller countries like New Zealand of maintaining influence inside an international system of increasing complexity becomes no easier. Equality of responsibility and equivalence of obligation inside the international system are, for great and small countries alike, indispensable to rules-based behavior. The China-United States relationship will be a paramount influence in the future. Both countries possess a strong sense of their own exceptionalism, mandated for each by Providence, it seems. The United States has a well-established practice of standing aside from multilateral rules or from negotiating processes where it deems these to infringe American sovereignty or interests. That is an example which China may well be disposed to copy. We would hope not. New Zealand's foreign policy interests identify clearly with even-handed disavowal of that principle of exceptionalism and resistance to any sense that the interest of one great power necessarily or automatically trump the interests of the other. Excuse me. Walking the right line here is a supreme challenge for New Zealand's external policy, unequaled in our previous international relations experience. We must act as required, together with like-minded others. This may involve drawing a distance from New Zealand's traditional This may involve drawing a distance from New Zealand's traditional mainstays and keeping different company at different times on different issues. Maintaining influence depends vitally, upon reputation, which itself requires constant cultivation. Those were Terence's own words, and I commend them to you. I think they are as relevant today as they were when he gave them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. Indeed, these words resonate again today. Our third speaker is John O'Brien. Please welcome him.
Kia ora. My name is John O'Brien. I am Terence's eldest son. We had 3 sons. One's me, the oldest, Daniel on the back, brother Tim, who's in Australia, and a sister George, who's an orphan, who couldn't be here. And I'd also like to pay tribute to my mother Elizabeth, who's sitting in the audience and who spent hours editing my speech, and everywhere I wrote my father, she changed it to Terence. Right, so I'll try not to make that mistake. So I think you all heard from the audio that my father was passionate about young people, and he really believed that young people need to be encouraged because young people are often less cynical than older people, and young people believe that, you know, some of the strands of insularity that existed in New Zealand foreign relations should be changed. The world is a lot more global now, and one of the reasons he gave the scholarships at Victoria University is he believed in the power of young people. And perhaps one of the reasons he called his memoirs The Consolations of Insignificance, they're not yet published, is reflecting his world viewpoint. You know, my father, Terence, was widely acknowledged as an informed and interesting commentator on international affairs, in that he was someone who thought deeply and had a huge library of books. He was a gifted speaker, he had a warm, outgoing personality, and he was widely called upon by journalists, especially in New Zealand, for insightful comments on international affairs. And he aimed, after he left Foreign Affairs, he aimed to help the public understand complex issues in a way that he viewed things, which is that New Zealand needs to be more independent. One of the things I think that characterized my Terence was that he had this integrity, and after he left and set up the centre, he was willing to speak truth to power, even if it got into trouble sometimes. For example, in the early 2000s, he criticized the decision at the time to purchase or to want to purchase F-16 fighter planes, which he thought we didn't need, and that wasn't very popular and landed him in a bit of hot water. And he was also not afraid to speak his mind. So, for example, in 2003, when the Gulf War and the United States called on New Zealand to send forces for the Second Gulf War, he received a call from the former Prime Minister Helen Clark, who asked him for his viewpoint, and he said, no, absolutely not. There's no UN resolution. This is misguided. We shouldn't be involved in that. And former Prime Minister Helen Clark told me that was the best foreign policy decision I ever made. Probably why she didn't end up being the UN Secretary General. Leave it aside. Yeah. Anyway, my father, Terence, believed in soft power, as was mentioned by former speakers, and that small countries like New Zealand could influence international relations by their way of arguing. And he also believed there's no one way of doing things correctly, and that being successful doesn't necessarily depend on the Western way and imitating that way. So what do we mean by an independent foreign policy? Well, there's 2 things. One is an intermittent pattern of behaving differently over a long period of time, and the other is on some big one-off decisions. And the big decision that really, I think, set New Zealand on the course where the world saw us as more independent or different was the anti-nuclear policy, when the USS Buchanan was refused entry into the ports. And of course, banning US warships from New Zealand ports by being a member of ANZUS at the time appalled certain politicians and senior public servants at the time. And while it seems normal now to say that New Zealand is anti-nuclear, back then it was quite controversial and debated. And the Terence, in his memoirs, he made a joke about this because, as former Prime Minister Bolger said, we weren't on speaking terms. He said the closest contact that the New Zealander came to an American official in the 90s was when my son John bumped into Dan Quayle on the top of Vale Mountain. I was skiing, and I bumped into Dan Quayle and his wife. And his wife said, I love your foreign policy. And then he also, he got along well with former Prime Minister Longy, who once famously quipped the American ambassador who had horses. One of his horses was called Lack of Reason. He said, "Oh, you're the only American ambassador who's got a horse named after your foreign policy." Anyway, and Daniel, my brother, found a cable from 1990 when Right Honourable Jim Bolger, who's here today, was speaking about the anti-nuclear policy and how we need to reaffirm it. And Terence written in the margins of the cable, "This is pretty clear. Honest Jim has said what was said at the Yale speech and more. Now there's a real chance for foreign affairs to work properly." Anyway, so Terence understood how difficult it is for the United States to change in an environment in the 21st century where relations between countries will be conducted in a more diverse international environment and where the international rules-based system is not working as well as it should. BRICS account for 50% of world GDP and 70% of world's foreign currency reserves. The days of the hegemonic situation the US once was in are over. But this doesn't mean, as my mother Elizabeth told me to make sure to mention this point, that my Terence was not anti-American, as someone suggested. It's not true. He admired the US and its contributions and its legendary capacity for innovation. What he didn't like was the hypocrisy, having all these UN rules and treaties that are selectively followed sometimes, and other times they're not. For example, the 2003 US invasion of Iraq is okay, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not okay. For him, they're both equally abhorrent, and both are not okay. He didn't like that countries such as Russia and China should be bound by the rules, but the US could selectively apply them. But that doesn't mean he was anti-American. So I'm going to say a few words about the UN. So my father believed in the values of the UN. The UN was set up to free the world from the scourge of war. He saw the UN as an important forum for nations to discuss issues like conflict resolution, peacekeeping environment. And he thought, as a small country, New Zealand, it's in our interest to follow the rules-based order. And his father of his career, I think, was being in New York in the 90s when we were on the Security Council. And he was incredibly grateful to Right Honourable Jim Bolger for allowing him to serve on the Security Council. And he really believed that the UN, though, was in need of dire and urgent reform. It's got a crisis at the moment, that there are huge bureaucracies, inefficient, overlapping mandates, and that the UN is often toothless. I also spent time explaining to him the internal justice system and how there's issues with the lack of accountability, how the United Nations evaluates itself, it audits itself, it investigates itself, and the investigation units report to the senior management who are often doing the wrongdoing. And he knew and understood how it's a serious problem. And he understood that the UN needs reform. I want to say a few words about relations with New Zealand and China. My father, Terence, believed New Zealand must accept the emergence of China in the 21st century as a major power. He understood the US-China relationship will set the tenor for modern international relations. But the key point is he thought that the United States and China should try to be friends. And if there are differences, I see the Honourable Ambassador from China said that New Zealand should not have to take sides. New Zealand should not have to choose, are we with the US or are we with China? He thinks that New Zealand's insecurity is not best served by a single-minded dependence on one large patron, the US, and he noted that the bulk of New Zealand's trade, I think it's over 50% now, goes to China and Asia, leaving New Zealand potentially vulnerable. He's also thought that the New Zealand Defence Force should be more involved in UN peacekeeping operations rather than interoperability with NATO. In the economic sphere, Terence pointed out, New Zealand has a whole of government policy towards Asia, but in the defense sphere, New Zealand continues to focus on the Atlantic, NATO, and the US and Europe. Very few words now before I finish, because Matty rings the bell. On the Middle East, Terence thought that it is self-deceiving to believe that there's no connection between the rise of radical Islam and the wars that were from the West, which were bent on spreading interests and values in the Middle East. And a mistake has been made with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which he thought was totally misguided. Last point, Russia-Ukraine war. So this is interesting because most people don't think this. So I spent 12 years working in Russia and Ukraine, and I've been to Kiev many times, to Minsk, to Moscow. I understand how the people think there. And I discussed it with my father, Terence, only a few months ago. And, the origins are complex. It comes about from the end of the Soviet Union and the Cold War and the relations between NATO and possible expansion. So I explained to my father that while we all agree, and everyone can agree, that an invasion of one country is totally wrong, the situation is not black and white. Having been to Crimea and Eastern Ukraine myself and met with people, the people in those areas are much more Russian than they are European. whereas in the West, the situation is different. I explained that it's not black and white to my father, that it's grey, and he said, yes, he agrees with you, and I think New Zealand should stay out of it completely, not take sides. And he once remarked in his final months, he thought that Zelensky was pulling Europe and the world into World War III by its nose. That doesn't mean he's pro-Putin. He just understood that it's more complicated than just the CNN summary of the good guys against the bad guys, and he believed in peaceful resolutions. I think we all do. And so I think what makes my father unique is that he understood that New Zealand's interests were not necessarily best served by just having things as black and white, and we need to have our own opinions about things and to look at things in a bit more depth and with more complexity. And he had hundreds and hundreds of books, and he loved what he was doing, and so I miss him. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for speaking with your heart. Our next speaker is Malcolm McKinnon. Please welcome him.
Tēnā koutou katoa, and thank you for the welcome, Matthew, and I'm especially privileged to Elizabeth and it's that they're here. One of the advantages of being fourth is that you know you're not going to get to 8 minutes because much of what you want to say has already been said, and I don't want to punish you by repeating some of the insightful points that the Porter, Michaels, and John have just made. I didn't actually know Terence that well. I got to know him when he was at CSS, and I was often at seminars with him, and was always struck by his very cogent and insightful contributions to those discussions. But I thought that, therefore, rather than try and recollect personal episodes in the friendship, I would look at what he wrote, and I didn't have that book to hand, but I went through all the many articles he wrote for New Zealand National Review, probably upwards of 50. And it was interesting to look at them and to think both about the recurrent themes, which in a way we've already touched on, but also the way that these sit within what I would think of as I'm destroying myself, history of New Zealand's foreign policy. So I took out of that reading, and I could have taken many more themes, but I thought there were three that were worth dwelling on. The first one, which John was just speaking very eloquently about, was the significance of the United Nations and the significance in Terence's mind of multilateralism as being something that needed to be grounded in the United Nations. Now that you can see has a lineage going right back to the establishment of the United Nations in 1945 and the role that Peter Fraser and his team in particular play in trying to ensure that the United Nations will not be simply a great power organization, but a genuinely organization of all the nations of the world. And that theme comes through all the time in Terence's comment, and he's often quite sardonic about what he sees as it were, claimants to the UN mantle. He's very interesting, very critical when it starts up about the G20, seeing it as being something that was attempting to sort of rival the United Nations. He's also similarly questioning of NATO's claim to a global footprint, and he talks equally, and of course this relates to the Iraq situation in 2003, exactly 20 years ago this week, I think, of organized arrangements like coalitions for willing. So that was one strong element, and he often also talks about what he thinks is New Zealand's very anodyne contribution to UN peacekeeping forces. If you wonder about that, have a look at the number of peacekeepers that Ireland deploys compared to the number that New Zealand deploys. As this one thing you see the point that Terence is making there. So that was the first theme I took out of reading through Terence's writing. Second one was the importance of New Zealand engaging directly with rising regions in the world. And obviously that could be, in some respects, distilled into a single word, maybe China. But I think what really comes through in Terence's writing, however, there's much more to do with the whole of the, if you like, the second and third worlds, as they were at the time, maybe when he was first trying his diplomatic spurs in the 1960s and 70s, and New Zealand confronted a much more economically insecure world and had to establish relationships with oil states, with communist states, with states in Asia, which had previously had relatively little to do with. And that notion that you had to keep on developing those relationships is a really strong theme. In the period where I was reading all these articles, it was much more focused on Asia Pacific. So yes, China, but also the states of ASEAN and Japan and Korea, seen in their own terms, not just in terms of their alliance with the United States. And I think one can lay that out and see that it remains as relevant at the moment as it was through those years that I was looking at this writing that Terence was commenting on these kinds of issues and their importance. And as I said, I think that goes back to the 60s and 70s, but we can see it as an ongoing theme into the present and into the future. And the third theme I was going to take out and will take out is the theme of the anti-nuclear policy. And this has also been touched on. Now, I think there's an interesting nuance here. In my view, the anti-nuclear policy within New Zealand and the way that it achieves such widespread support in New Zealand had a very strong NIMBY element. It was very much a not in my backyard policy. It didn't necessarily, for most New Zealanders, have a lot to do with concern about what was going on in the rest of the world in terms of the nuclear issue. But for Terence, and it comes through very strongly in all his writing, the whole point about the anti-nuclear policy was its global implications and his passionate commitment to disarmament, to opposing nuclear proliferation. We know that New Zealand was involved in setting up in 1998 the New Agenda Coalition, was designed to try and advance nuclear disarmament. I'm sure Mr. Bolger might be able to say something about that. And of course, more recently been is with the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, to which New Zealand is a signatory, and which had its first substantive meeting only last year. So I think this was another theme where Terence's writing and thinking was talking about the anti-nuclear policy, but not just as a trademark of New Zealand identity, but as something which was desperately important for the world as a whole. And I can only echo Mr. Bolger's closing comments in that respect, that this has never been truer than it is at the present time. It was a terrifically stimulating thing for me to go through all Terence's writing. It reminded me of what a rich and versatile and principled thinker he was. And he's missed. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. It was a tremendous effort to go through 15 years of work. We're very grateful. Our last speaker is Chris Seed. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Matthew. I've got the bell here, so I'm control of my life. Well, look, it's wonderful to be here. Can I just say, Elizabeth, our condolences to you on the loss of Terence, to the family. Terence is a very special person to many of the people in this room, and it's just wonderful to see the turnout and the acknowledgement that your presence speaks to his the contribution that he made to New Zealand in many walks of life. I'm among those who personally have reason to express gratitude for Terence's involvement in various times in my career. I'm also grateful actually to be here. Terence was a slow left-arm spinner. Not much talent. This is cricket for those who aren't familiar with it. When I was a youngster, we were playing at Kelvin Park. Terence, for some reason, decided that the further the batsman hit him, the closer we should all get. So fielders kept being moved closer. So 6, closer. Terence had a very sort of particular way of speaking. 6, another 6, closer. He obviously decided that expendable young second secretaries to get closest of all. We could hear the batsman breathing. There was yet another 6. And Gerald McGee, who is here tonight, eventually yelled out, "Terence, you need everyone closer to the boundary." So we were all allowed to move away and recover. Now, Terence, I must say, as a young person, Terence took I came across him several times in my career. He, although we had very different views on geopolitics and on a range of international events, his encouragement and the way in which he stayed in touch is something that I hold very dear. I do have presence of mind. New Zealand and the World, his book. I do have his salutation in it. Generously, thanks for all the help. I think that was said with irony. Terence, so I have 5 Ps that I wanted to draw on. Terence was a practitioner, a diplomatic practitioner. He had a career that touched the South Pacific. This included service there and in Asia and in Europe and in New York. Across our economic, security, bilateral and multilateral areas of our diplomatic tradecraft. That is the message, that is a message that my generation of leadership at the ministry continues to deliver to our young recruits, our young diplomatic officers, that they need to build capability that can operate across very different jurisdictions, because that tradecraft requires exposure and experience of that sort. He was purposeful. After his diplomatic career finished, he built up and out in his academic career as a lecturer and as a teacher and as a commentator. The last event where I saw Terence was at Professor David Capey's inaugural speech as a professor. David was the first employee that Terence brought onto the staff of the Centre for Strategic Studies. So he had grown, he had passed on that wisdom, and David's promotion to his professorship, and Terence's presence there, I thought was an absolutely wonderful thing. Terence was pragmatic. He wasn't starry-eyed about the world. He recognised the limitations. Many others have spoken better than me to his sense about how a small country is obliged to work in the world. But as a result of it, his judgment and his recommendations were all the better for it. I was always absolutely struck by his sense that part of New Zealand's diplomatic toolkit needed to be a professional, equipped defence force, that it was one of the essential assets which New Zealand requires to provide and protect our interests in the world. He was, and I use this term, it's an oldish term, but he was a patriot, a small p patriot. He was invested as a diplomat and as an academic and a commentator and as a citizen in the goal of sustaining and advancing New Zealand's interests in the world. And no matter the disagreements on policy, the interests that Terence spoke to about fair-mindedness, about the New Zealand operating in the world with the absence of grand design, the absence of resort to coercive power, about having a capacity for impartiality and for bringing a problem-solving mentality. He saw these as being assets in modern international relations, and they need to infuse and do infuse our modern foreign ministry. He was passionate, and I think we've heard plenty of that today. He was passionate about multilateralism. He was passionate, absolutely, about New Zealand. I think he drew a link between the dogged, focused, persistent advocacy in the example of how we secured our future as the UK joined the European Common Market back in the late 60s, early 70s, and how that needed to move and did move us into as a nation and a diplomatic service with a greater sense of confidence and identity about the region in which we needed to operate and we did live. And I always thought, as a young officer, his sense, before it was commonplace, he absolutely understood the way in which the national reconciliation is at the heart of the New Zealand political project. That the Treaty of Waitangi, the things that it stands for, and the way that we have decided as a nation to build that out politically was absolutely not only essential for New Zealand, but gave us a point of difference in the way we thought about the world. I'd also say that as a practitioner and as an operator, Terence also taught me some good things about political tradecraft. I remember an engagement with him when I was a very junior officer, second secretary on our delegation to the UN, the Commission on UNCED, anyway, Environment and Development. Met across several Pretcoms in New York, finished up with a Rio conference. The Australian leader of the Australian delegation was Sir Ninian Stephen, a former Governor General, a fine man, a great advocate for the trans-Tasman relationship. But in that way of Australians and New Zealanders, he tended to reduce things to the colloquial. So it was Terry this and Terry that at our morning meetings. So after the second of these, there was an urgent meeting amongst the New Zealand delegation. I see Peter Ryder's here. He was the one sent away to deal the message to our Australian colleagues. If you keep calling our guy Terry, we're going to start calling your guy Nini. At which point, order was resumed on all sides. But it was Terence's sense about his ability to see the humour in the situation, also to see a solution, and that ability to to engage in the moment and seek a solution. He will be much missed. His contribution to our diplomacy, to the conduct of our relations in the world, and to the modern foreign ministry is immense. And on behalf of the Foreign Ministry, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak today and to acknowledge that.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's wonderful we're on time, thanks to the bell donated by the guest of honor from above. So we have time to take questions and comments this time. 1.5 minutes per comment or question. Please wait for the microphone. One microphone for the speakers and one microphone for the audience, please. Before you start, please state your name and function and speak in the microphone. Yes, please. The gentleman at the back.
I have a question, but first I do want to pay tribute to Terence. I've just been reminded by Roy Ferguson that 50 years ago he was my boss in foreign affairs, and I had a science background, so he was the only senior member there who improved my writing without pissing me off. He was a terrific bloke. This is my question. One of the important issues, it seems to me, in developing an independent foreign policy is the importance of developing a bipartisan approach. No one has mentioned the problems of a bipartisan approach. I'd be interested in the comments of the panel, because if there is too much internal disagreement on foreign policy, It's an open invitation to our friends as well as our enemies. Our friends such as Australia and America, for example, to interfere with what's going on locally. So I'd be interested in the views of the panel. Oh, by the way, my name is Morris Ormsby, I'm a retired member of the ministry. Thank you.
Sounds like to come to me. I have to say, I think your ambition has been fulfilled to a very large extent. I've been across the world many times with different governments here in New Zealand, and New Zealand's foreign policy is a pretty standard, universal one. It's not vast differences between. Excuse me. And I'll draw a comparison, a very easy one, between, say, the US and we have two very distinct approaches, shown in the news most days, whereas New Zealand's approach is very much common. There was a possibility that we would have huge divisions on the nuclear policy. That lasted for a relatively short time till I sort of bridged that gap and brought that together again. So we don't have any differences of any consequence there. On trade policy, both parties in New Zealand, or the major parties that will lead the government in the future, have a very common approach. We have a very common approach. I'm looking at the Ambassador's Excellency from China here with it. We have a very common approach to our engagement with and acceptance of the importance of China to New Zealand's future and so forth. So I think the concern you raised is not a real one now in New Zealand. Of course, there are the outliers, but I think we work pretty well as a country with a pretty common foreign policy.
I was wondering what Christy would think of as well, but personal curiosity, if you don't mind, Christy.
You're wondering what Chrissy thinks. Well, let me, so a couple of points. The first is I would certainly reinforce Mr. Bolger's point, and I think the point of Morris's intervention, that bipartisanship is a fundamental, has to be an ambition for the New Zealand government, for the New Zealand Parliament, for the New Zealand system. That isn't arrived at, though, by providence. It's not, as Terence actually spoke about, some parts of the New Zealand system believing that we had special skills divinely given as mediators. Terence actually makes the point in some of his writings very well that our ability to operate in the world, but also to build our consensus domestically, comes about through hard work, through policy analysis, through testing ideas, through exchanging views with the various parties in our parliament. And that is a continuing challenge for our country and for many others. I would also say, just in looking historically, it's clearly the case that there have been areas of where New Zealand foreign, there hasn't been bipartisanship. There wasn't bipartisanship over the Vietnam War. There wasn't bipartisanship over exporting contacts with South Africa. There wasn't bipartisanship over TPP. So the fact that those issues have been dealt to and addressed has actually come about because there has been an investment subsequently across the parliament, across the political system, about figuring out a way forward. And that really takes me to the point I mentioned about where Terence's point that he often went back to about that idea of reconciliation sitting at the heart of our national political project, and that some of the skills and some of the journey we've been on there is actually applicable, including to the way we think about foreign policy. Thanks, Eddie.
Thank you very much. Any other comments from the panel? We're going to take another question, please. Yes, please. That's the gentleman. Yes. If you can please speak loudly.
My name is Kevin Z. I'm a local on the Chinese newspaper Home Voice. My question is, I want to ask you, Roger, and about China and New Zealand, America, how to build up the balance. Because a couple of days ago, Campbell, American Home Office, Campbell come visit Wellington, about talking about build up the high technology relation with the New Zealand and America. But look like I feel in the Cold War world coming to the. So how can we do to avoid American to cut off New Zealand with China the relation, like build up the high technology and stuff. Yeah, thank you.
Bit of a challenge to answer because I didn't get it quite clearly. Are you referring to the fact of the concern in many quarters in the United States in particular, but some in New Zealand, that Chinese high-tech firms could be gathering data on New Zealanders and New Zealand issues and so forth? Is that your concern?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have to say, I'm no expert on high technology, but I presume that all the major powers have broadly similar capacity to gather data. That it's not a skill that is only retained by one particular country or 2 or 3 countries. So my guess would be, I was talking about this only the other day to someone, that whatever skill the Chinese companies may have to capture data would be matched at least by the United States and with Europe. So I think if you're worried about something being captured, then don't say it in the first place. That includes on your phone.
Thank you.
That's reality. I mean, I have to say I'm no expert in this field. I know how to work a phone just about. But that's today's reality. It is possible to capture extraordinary information with modern technology. So, as I say, if you don't want it out there, better not say it.
Thank you.
Could I just add to that, say that we should bear in mind that it's not just people who are not our friends or whom we don't regard as friends who do the listening. The listening is likely to be from our very closest neighbours, and that's worth bearing in mind.
Going to take another question. Yes, please.
Yeah, my name is Ron Christie. I am an expert in IT.
Excellent.
Anyone that wants to talk to me about the question mentioned state actors, you've always been I'm happy to answer that question.
So you disagree with anything I said?
Yeah, some of the countries that you mentioned are very aggressive in attacking our digital economy. But more generally, I'm interested in how Terence's legacy is translated in works today. It feels like, to me, listening to the panel, as if our independence has become a policy of appeasement, and that rather than calling out tyranny and injustice, we're more likely to appease people like Vladimir Putin,
Example?
Donald Trump, and so on. Well,
Give an example to your question.
so
Give us an example of this appeasement.
question is, we keep referencing a policy that's 40 years old. Do we have the guts today to do what we did 40 years ago?
I protest at the way you frame that question. I will deny it totally. I think we have to show extraordinary guts to pursue the kinds of policies that we are now pursuing, which entails to friends and people who may not be friends, expressing our views to them and listening to their views. See nothing lazy or easy about that kind of approach, but others may have.
I just want to say something. I think appeasement is the wrong word. New Zealand hasn't been appeasing Vladimir Putin. It's strongly condemned the invasion. Terence's view was that we need to be even-handed. If we're going to apply international rules and laws to one country, we need to apply them to all countries. So I think, with all due respect, appeasement is the wrong word.
Thank you. Yes, please. Yes.
Matthew Birchall, historian. What lessons do you think we can draw from the first Cold War I've not read Terence's work. I was born 1991 at the end of the Cold War, and it seems like the best case scenario of the current conflict between China and the US is that it remains cold. And I just wondered, for those of you who are familiar with Terence's work, what you'd make of that way of framing how New Zealand can position itself in potentially a new Cold War.
Just a brief response. I think it's very difficult to take the Cold War use the terms necessary. One of the reasons being that the two competitors, if you like, are deeply economically intertwined with each other. It's not true. Secondly, and this is perhaps more debated, you could argue that they don't represent completely distinct ideologies, and certainly not crusading ideologies. Thirdly, I would argue there's probably bigger stakes, like some rhetoric in trying to avoid a deterioration.
That was brilliant, thank you. So if we put the framing to one side, that kind of tends to be a semantic argument. I'm more interested in the institutional experience that New Zealand's built up. It seems like that's where, you know, in the Cold War context, that's where New Zealand forged an independent foreign policy. What lessons can we draw from that time frame if you have a small country that is buffeted in this mean geopolitical world? There seem to be some similarities with the position that we're in now.
I think this is a question we could debate for hours and hours, and unfortunately our time is limited. On this, Malcolm can give a very
Just very quickly,
short answer. Yeah.
solution certainties that credit the space for
The lady at the back, please.
I regret calling up the American, but country. My question might be a bit of a softball to end on a light note, but given your knowledge of Terence, if there's one thing you think you would wish to be conveyed to the United States from an understanding of New Zealand's point of view, this is your chance for a one-liner. You're welcome. But if there was one thing you wish would be conveyed via the United States or other countries, what do you think that line would be?
I'm going to jump up and say speaking truth to power.
Practice what you preach. Speaking truth to power.
Those answers are all far too short. I think what New Zealand has displayed almost universally is realism. We know we can't dictate to other countries, maybe a small Pacific island for a week or two, but you know, the realism is we're a small country. We don't have huge economic power, we certainly don't have huge military power. What we can have is persuasive power. We should concentrate on our strength.
Yes, please.
Hi, Dr. Diane, I'm from Victoria University. It's probably leading on from what you were saying, Roger. In terms of thinking about this, what can we do? We are a small nation, isolated. We have some strong relationships which come and go. But realistically, where do you think our place is in the world that has changed significantly over time? And perhaps some of our moral standing, things like in the foreign policy, has changed. Where do you think we stand now? And do we actually have much importance, being a tiny little country at the moment. And I'm making some leading words.
We are a small country. The world is in constant change. Just reflect a little bit in the lifetime of people as old as me. We grew up in the British Empire that ruled the world. The sun never set on the British Empire. There was some part of Britain that still had the sun. And that's until a small little man in India called Gandhi. And when India went to independence, that was the end of the British Empire that ruled the world. So what we've seen over the years is the changing centres of power. And the Western Europe, countries of Western Europe ruled the world before influence is the word I'm looking for, influence until the end of World War II, when power moved across the Atlantic to the United States. No question about that. That's what happened. I'm looking at the ambassador from China in front of me, and I would agree with those who would say that power is now moving from the United States to China. And how long? Well, you can speculate. But China is the epitome of one of the great problems of the world, which we're not touching on. And that is, of course, the decline in birth rate. And very old societies, and China is right at the front of this because of a one-child policy, that we're now seeing other issues emerging. We have to avoid just locking ourselves in the thinking of the past. How are we going to manage society when we have very many older people than we have young people? Yes, artificial intelligence will do some of the work. Can't do it all. So we've got new challenges, they're quite different challenges, and what, if anything frustrates me looking across the world, the whole of it, is nobody is really addressing some of those. They're real, just starting to emerge in some countries, just starting to face that fact. But it's here, it's already here, and it can't be changed. We've watched France having a terrible debate, still is, on retirement age. New Zealand will have in 20 years twice as many people on the retirement pension as now. Do you think we can afford it? If so, tell us where all the money is now. Twice as many. And that's permanent, there's no guarantee, that's not speculation, they're already born, they're 40-year-old. These are some of the challenges we need to be looking at rather than ancient history.
We have time for one more question. Yes, I will take both of you actually, if it's short. And then it's...
My name is Peter Adams, and being a former member of the ministry, I have great respect and fondness for Terence, with whom I interacted as a junior diplomat for 30. I wonder if there's a risk of conflating independence with even-handedness. Even-handedness is certainly, as we've heard tonight, equidistance, a kind of highly useful principle for making sure that we don't simply go with the flow with our traditional friends. But there will be times in foreign policy issues when independence is not even-handedness, and we do have to fall off on one side or the other of an issue. Take Ukraine, for example. So we say that it's absolutely unacceptable that Russia should invade Ukraine. But do we also say, well, what about the United States? They invaded Iraq, and we didn't agree with that. So therefore, we won't take a view. We'll be even-handed. I think on an issue like that, independence should not be conflated with even-handedness. Independence is actually forming a moral judgment that is not right down the middle, but recognizes a difference in the circumstance.
Thank you. So would any of our panelists like to comment on this? Yes, please, Frida.
Thanks, Peter. Yes, just to reinforce the point. I mean, I think to pick up the question here, the New Zealand's ability to operate in the world is we do have agency, we do have ability, and Terence, as much as one disagreed with him, and probably so, on a whole range of judgments or policy positions he exercised judgment on, the end of the day, he was certainly open to that the big issues had to be debated and you had to have a view. And on Ukraine is in a sense a perfect example, both of where I would disagree with Terence and I support Peter on this. The New Zealand government, a properly commissioned government, the full support of the Parliament, has been outraged by what's happened in Ukraine. That is why we have sent material support. We have provided humanitarian support. We've allowed preferential arrangements for Ukrainian visa holders to come to New Zealand. That's why we're supporting the ICC and the ICJ and their prosecution of Russian war criminals. That's why we've got over 100 people, NZD colleagues, training Ukrainian forces in the United Kingdom. Because something material, which is undermining the international system, has happened. And independence, to Peter's point, is not sitting on the fence and saying that this is the same as something that happened in Iraq. These are very different events. In New Zealand, the New Zealand government of the time has taken a very firm position because they've exercised judgment in the name of the citizens of the country. Thank you.
Any other comments? Please.
Could I just make a quick comment? I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding. I don't believe, Peter, that Terence argued for sitting on fences and not taking positions. I think he argued rather for taking clear positions and being prepared to speak up. I think being even-handed means being prepared to speak up. And that's what I believe we have tried to do. We have not been perfect and necessarily always consistent there. But that's what, on the whole, we've tried.
Just recall it was mentioned earlier that New Zealand didn't join the Second Iraqi War. We made a judgment, Alan Clark's government, a judgment that that wasn't justified. And it was a very wise decision in retrospect. I mean, the whole jack-up that there was a nuclear threat there, nuclear arms and all the rest would prove to be absolutely wrong. You know, I think it's a difficult balance, but I think it's one that New Zealand has exercised with some prudence and I think some skill. We won't get it right, of course, but we won't have all the information. But I think we have across political parties, it's not partisan, it's just, I think, how we have positioned ourselves, and I think as a small country, wisely positioned ourselves as well.
Thank you. Just a last question, please, and we wrap up. Thank you. Yes, please.
I'm Ray Salvo. I'm from the United Nations Association. I'm president for Aotearoa New Zealand. I really appreciate what's been said about the independence and independent foreign policy, although I feel that the better, more fully explained is that was independent engagement, because there's a lot of engagement in Terence's ideas. But the question I want to ask is about the security. We live in a world where most people, when talk about national security, they look to defence. Is there any argument for saying that our Terence's ideas provide a basis for our security?
Michael, would you like to comment that, please?
Just wanted to say what Terence said and some of the stuff I was reading is that the majority of New Zealand's trade is China, Asia, and Australia, which make up 70%. But our defense relationship is with the Atlantic and with the US, and so he just saw that as a vulnerability. But I don't think he saw New Zealand as a country that should engage deeply and effectively with all partners. And so being an independent country means looking at everything from a unique New Zealand perspective. New Zealand's not the same as the other Anglo-Saxon countries because we have the Treaty of Waitangi because of our location. So I think that would sum it up.
I would agree that I think Terence would agree. What we've been going through for the last few decades is this transition from I mentioned earlier, the British Empire, but also been totally identified with the European issues. Given our settlement policy and so forth, that's not, over the last couple of centuries, that's not surprising. But that has moved, and I recall speaking, it excited the New Zealand media, a couple of whom are here. I recall speaking in Singapore a few years back, and some questioner wanted to quiz me, they're all economists, as to how we could develop our relationship with Asia, since we were so far away, according to this particular question. And I pointed out that he was totally wrong. Our history had been engaging very closely, particularly in trade and economic terms, with Europe, which was much, much further away. From a modern perspective, I said to him, and this is what got more excited, I said, from my perspective, we are part of Asia. If you get a map of the world out, get the atlas out, you'll see which part of the world we're closest to. I mean, and demonstrably it's Asia. The largest Muslim country in the world, Indonesia, is relatively close to us. I mean, we've got to move a little further from our original settling, which was the British Empire, to the world that exists today. And we're doing that. And we're not only doing that intellectually, we're doing that if we look at the composition of New Zealand today. It is so dramatically different to what it was in my youth. Radically different. And we know that, and we see it, and we welcome it.
Thank you very much. Now I invite Dan O'Brien for some concluding remarks, please.
So I wanted to start quickly. If Dan or Terence, I said that Terence was here today, he would have an opinion on everything that's been said, and it would be quite strong. So just to sort of nuance there, and especially on new issues like the Ukraine war, I think we've got to be careful when we represent other people's views as well. Exactly what it is. There's always nuance in what he said when we talk to him. Anyway, I'm going to conclude. So hi, I'm Dan O'Brien. I'm Terence Libby's third in line, spare to the spare, so to speak. I support Matthew as co-founder of Diplosphere, usually taking on the tech jobs, but also helping with ideation write-ups, of which there will be one for this one today, so stay tuned on more on that. And in my day job, I help New Zealand tech startups build and grow with Amazon Web Services. Good to see you here, Tristana, representing. Quite different from a field from Terence, but one that only enriched our conversations that we had. And in Libby and Terence's house growing up, when we were young, we debated current affairs, often, usually loudly. Dad always wanted to hear our views, and later in life as well. And he tested many ideas on us, like guinea pigs to a certain extent. The themes when it came to New Zealand's place in the world we've discussed today resonate over decades. Even-handedness versus exceptionalism, independence of mind, the inexorable shift from west to east, the precept that all foreign policy begins at home, the importance of reconciliation and the Treaty of Waitangi for Aotearoa New Zealand, the multilateral rules-based world order, which has stood New Zealand in such good stead, a deep appreciation for history, but an ever youthful gaze to a better future. Reviewing dozens of Terence's articles and talks in the past few weeks confirmed the consistency of principle and approach. But I thought the starting point of today that Matty brought up is also a great way to conclude. Matty picked up on Terence's points of gratitude and optimism. I think all our speakers will agree these hallmarks have come through in Terence's works. And here are some of the points from the speakers that I quickly, that resonated. I'll get a better write-up later. But I think first from the Right Honourable Jim Bolger, I really like the line, all we can do is lead by intellectual example. It's a fantastic calling call for young New Zealanders, for all New Zealanders, because it is the way that we can make our impact on the world. I love hearing the anecdotes about the ILO, the UN, and the presidential meeting there. And the thought about being independent, the nuance between independence and isolationism, the difference there, and it's not the same thing, right? That was great. And from Michael Paul's, the comments on the challenges of maintaining a small nation influence, that speech, I like the point around the delicate choice, the walking the right line with the emergence of China and the US in this new world. And from my older brother John, used to beat me up when I was younger, got to get that in there. The power of young people. that was really important. I mean, it's absolutely the case. And the best foreign policy decision made by Prime Minister Helen Clark raised that point, which was really a good one. And I think that the thing around the United Nations, and John, you especially obviously having worked at UNDP for so many years, and big advocate of the UN as well. But it's need to have reform as well. Dad was a big believer in that as well. Malcolm McKinnon, I just wanted to recap, the importance of New Zealand engaging with rising states, especially in Asia, but not just China. The legacy of the anti-nuclear policy and commitment to non-proliferation, absolutely. The importance of UN-based multilateralism, and the fact that you reviewed so many of Terence's writings over from the last 15 years. And the importance of peacekeeping, that point around peacekeeping was really interesting. And finally, on Chris Seed, on your personal reflections on Terence thinking on New Zealand foreign policy, cricket, I just got hit for 3 sixes Buffalo 2 weeks ago, and I had Dad who's sort of talking in my head, and he was saying, give the ball flight, Daniel. But I just got hit for 6 again, so I completely can think about that. And the 5 Ps that you mentioned, practitioner, purposeful, pragmatic, patriot, lowercase p, and passionate, and seeing a solution, pragmatic, I think especially pragmatic, seeing solutions and things was great. And so I'll end up with this. So thank you, panelists. Thank you very much. We know how much effort goes into preparing this, and we appreciate it. Terence also published a book. You've seen that today, Presence of Mind, which some of you may be interested in. He also wrote nearly completed memoirs that John referred to, which the family is working to get published. There's an info sheet, if you haven't picked it up, which has details. You feel free to pick one up. And there's information about Diplosphere, and you can keep up to date on the blog post that we're going to summarize of this proceedings today. We're at Diplosphere. We're a small, independently funded through conferences and events. So we run on the smell of an oily rag. We too fly under the radar, nimble, responsive, independent, hopefully even-handed. We love this stuff. We rely on your support. So thanks for coming here, especially our Diplosphere members, and thank you, MFAT, for the consideration of drinks, including the Chardonnay. And a final ending note on gratitude and optimism. Mum, Libby, I should say. I know you have enabled Terence's part and acted as a sounding board for his reflections over the years. And Matty, what an effort it is as a founder against the odds, sick with Diplosphere, and as Dad said late last year, you make things happen. Bigger and better is yet to come. Thank you.